No, I wasn't cured. Love is a disease in a world where only hatred's natural. Hey everybody, thank you as always for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I have the pleasure of talking about José Emilio Pacheco, Las batallas en el desierto. José Emilio Pacheco, Battles in the Desert. This handsome little 40th anniversary edition, complete with an afterword by Fernanda Melchor, put out in 2020 by New Directions. As Melchor says in her afterword called The Magic of Simplicity, for decades, Battles in the Desert has been one of the most widely read novels in Mexico. And since its second edition, it became part of standard middle school and high school curricula throughout the country, especially in the capital, Mexico City. Pacheco himself was born in Mexico City and died in Mexico City. Pacheco stands with Fuentes, Juan Rulfo, and others who are also part of school curricula. Pacheco won the highest award you can get for Spanish literature, that being the Cervantes Prize. He also has a great translation of T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets that he worked on meticulously for years and years. We might do well to pit this short book up against Aura and Pedro Páramo to get a sense of where this book fits. I'm not comparing it in terms of quality to the other two. I'm saying that it stands with them. The difference is that whereas Fuentes builds lots and lots of ambiguous and mysterious atmosphere and brings in the spiritual conception of ghosts. And then Juan Rulfo in Pedro Páramo has an incredible conception of time and how that plays out. Pedro Páramo is wonderful. I've got a video on that one. It's a little old. And it also deals with ghosts spiritually, but also ghosts that appear because of a fracture in time. In the same way, but different, we have José Emilio Pacheco in Battles in the Desert taking on the concept of time in a more straightforward manner, but looking at it more in terms of a grown man looking back on his childhood and filled with nostalgia. It has its own relation to time and to ghosts, but it's not taken to the same places it's taken to in Rulfo and Fuentes. Nonetheless, do not let its deceptive simplicity fool you. I read this thing sitting in my car on lunch break. It took me about 45 minutes to read it. It's only about 60 pages long. And the language is written so simply, so deceptively simply, that it's almost like extremely slick ice as compared to other types of ice, where you could just go gliding right across it without noticing, taking time to walk carefully across it and notice all of the crystal formations just under the surface. So I had to turn around the next day and read this thing again. I will say that on my first read, though I flew through it, the pivotal moment that I will not mention in this video punched me in the gut. It took my breath away. It's still with me. It lingers with me as if it really happened to me and not Carlos. Simply put, the plot revolves around a character, Carlos, who's looking back on his formative years in school, and in particular, a very specific event that altered the course of his life. So we're dealing with Mexico in about the mid-20th century and then on into the later 20th century. And what's done so well here is what's done so well in another novel that I have started reading recently, a Hungarian novel called Fatelessness by Imre Kirtes. And what works so well in both of these cases is that this world that they're evoking is filtered and therefore constrained through the mind of innocent youth, but on the cusp of the coming of age. We're right on the cusp of this dark side of our world, the evil and unfortunate side of our world being revealed to these innocent characters. Another thing that this book is it's a catalog of cultural references that work to evoke a certain time and place, that time and place being again mid to later 20th century and the place being Mexico City and the places around Mexico City. And although I could enjoy most of it, it's very obvious that someone who has also grown up in Mexico will love this book because I'm sure they'll relate to a lot of the references that I just didn't get. I, of course, know about the PRI that dominated the Mexican government from 1929 to about 2000. But I didn't know, for example, about the sack man that comes up in here. And when I started looking into it, there's this Iberian and Latin American lore around the concept of the sack man. This is a man who comes and kidnaps children. The story revolves around young Carlos, who ends up meeting the mother of one of his friends at school, and he immediately falls helplessly in love with this older woman. This love burns within him, drives out everything else from his mind, and finally he ends up leaving school in the middle of the school day and marching over to her house to profess his love. Suffice it to say that this is an impossible love. As he states it so eloquently and poignantly, the only thing anybody can do at his age is fall in love secretly, silently, like I have with Mariana. Fall in love knowing that all is lost and there is no hope. This is predominantly, I'd say, a book about falling in love with the idea of something that could never be. Not only in the form of Mariana, but in the form of this idealized Mexico of his youth when he's, for example, in the movie theater watching all of these double features and Disney movies. As he finds out later, in those same movie theaters, they would show newsreels. Along with the Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse, Popeye the Sailor Man, Woody Woodpecker, and Bugs Bunny cartoons, they showed newsreels. Bombs flattening cities, cannons, battles, fire, rubble, dead bodies. So now, in retrospect, everything's tinged with sadness, but there's nonetheless this idealized past that both does and does not exist. Because it's in the past, it only exists as a ghost in his memory. What's extraordinary is the way that Pacheco balances all of this historical detail, but maintains a very swift present narrative. And it gives us, the readers, the impression that the past is a bridge that's crumbling behind us with every step we make. Jim showed me his collection of ballpoint pens. Fountain pens smelled nasty and leaked slimy ink. Ballpoints were all the rage that year, when we used inkwells, pen holders, and blotters for the last time. And so with that small example, we see that there's this fracturing of the idealized past, the young Carlos, through whom the older Carlos constrains this narrative. Young Carlos doesn't know that they're going to be using inkwells and so on for the last time, but grown Carlos knows. And therefore, within the same person, you have a history that doesn't exist and a history that does exist superimposed on one another. All through the book, he talks about buildings that used to be there and no longer are. Part of it is, of course, not just pure nostalgia and typical separation that we have to live in of past, present, and future. Some of it points to the political and economic milieu. For example, Carlos's father has done well owning a soap company, but now all of these American companies have bombarded Mexico with factories, and they've absorbed his father's factory and replaced the old school soap with these new fancy chemical detergents. So we get a glimpse of Carlos's father at 48 years old having to learn English in order to maintain a job. Carlos sees his father studying English and he says, "How strange to see a person his age, an old man of 48, studying." Back to the impossible love. As he professes his love, as embarrassed as he is to do so, because this isn't a sexual love foremost. This is puppy love. He's totally smitten by Mariana. And she tells him that's how this infatuation, forgive me, falling in love. So in her mind, just like we all would, and we do as readers, we're, oh, this is an infatuation, this is a physical attraction. She thinks the same, but then she respectfully corrects herself and refers to it as what he has just professed it to be, that of falling in love. But she says it will pass. They're not going to talk about it. He needs to see her as his friend's mother and nothing more, and they'll just move on and not talk about it. And she says that over time, it'll pass. She wants the situation to avoid becoming a problem for you, a tragedy that could damage your whole life. But where this book succeeds so well is the fact that the damage is already done. In a way, the damage is already done, and Carlos hasn't done anything. This is a matter of a spiritual realm, a matter of the heart. In reaction, his parents freak out and they send him to the Catholic priest for confession and these prescribed Hail Marys and so on. And ironically, the priest brings up what he calls abusing himself, asking Carlos, do you abuse yourself? Carlos has no idea what the priest is talking about, but the priest doesn't realize that. The priest goes on to give these vivid details about it, which ends up causing Carlos to try it out. They send him to a psychiatrist, and there's a hilarious parody of Freudian psychology in here. The girl who administered the final test and the man talked in front of me. They acted as if I were a piece of furniture. Doctor, it is clearly an Oedipal issue. The child's intelligence is well below average. He's been overprotected and is submissive. A castrating mother, perhaps. A primal scene. He went to see that woman knowing that he might find her with her lover. I'm sorry, Elisita, but I am of the opposite opinion. The boy is highly intelligent and unusually precocious. So much so that by the time he turns 15, he may turn into a perfect idiot. His abnormal behavior stems from neglect, excessive demands from both parents, a strong inferiority complex. Don't forget, he's very short for his age, and he's the youngest male child. Notice how he identifies with the victims, with animals and trees that can't defend themselves. He is looking for the affection that he cannot find within the family constellation. And of course, Carlos talks about how he just wants to shout at the top of his lungs for them to knock all of this mumbo jumbo off. Because really, as they're trying to sit there and pinpoint him within the Freudian matrix, what everyone around Carlos is failing to see is his advanced level of innocence and sensitivity. He is an extremely sensitive young man with a deep, deep well of morals and conscience. And in fact, this depth of conscience that Carlos has is totally incompatible for the world that he's growing up in. The title of the book, Battles in the Desert, gets its name from the recess wars, as Carlos calls them, that in the school that he starts off in when we begin this narrative, they play war at lunchtime during recess. They split into groups, Jews and Arabs. We also get a view of them mocking and ridiculing a Japanese student. Carlos hates this, and he tries to talk to his friends and tell them, think about if you were the only Mexican student in a school in Japan, how you would feel to be picked on like this. He has this advanced level of empathy that everyone around him seems to lack. He's in a world that loves to hate and hates to love, a lot like our own world. And again, another thing that we can see here when we get these images of these school kids fighting against each other on ethnic divides is that by nature, they mock what is different and they emulate what is seen. They're emulating all of the wars in the Middle East. But later in the book, we find out that Carlos is this way partly because his father took him aside and told him to stop calling another student who figures very prominently in the ending of the book, to stop calling that student an Indian with a derogatory sense to it, a racial slur. His father tells him all Mexicans are Indians, whether they want to admit it or not. And he says that he's very thankful for this talk from his father because now it's helped him to see past superficial differences. And so to me, there's a whole element to this book that puts a huge responsibility on parents. For every one of us who decides to have a child, we have a huge responsibility to get them past that nature that wants to mock what is different and ridicule what's different. At one point, at the height of his frustration with everyone around him, his parents, his school teacher, the priest, the psychiatrist, all failing to see the real situation here and just trying to jump into solutions. He says, we're all hypocrites, unable to see ourselves or judge ourselves as we see and judge others. To think that this is required school reading in Mexico fills me with another level of admiration for that country. This is an incredible book to put in front of kids during their formative years. Even though I'm something like 20 years out of scope, this nonetheless hit me so hard because I realized that I've lost a lot of the simplicity that's inherent in the language here. And losing that and accepting the penchant that adults have for making everything complicated or not just seeing things for simply what they are has started to become deadened within me. And this book certainly roused that sleeping giant. But man, in the end, the love story in here and the implications of the big reveal, the big moment, and you'll know it when it takes your breath away. It's going to be with me for a long time. I highly, highly, highly recommend Battles in the Desert by José Emilio Pacheco, in a 40th anniversary edition by New Directions and in translation by Katherine Silver.